everybody. But
So I was just trying to get us to talk a little bit about the relationship that you and I kept talking about is mapping something different? Is it something new? Storyboard going to replace it? What is it exactly?
okay, I think that, and fingers crossed we're okay. So the interesting thing that happened is, as Bena mentions, we have decades of work on mapping, and the initial work really began almost 3.5 decades ago, and it kept growing and growing. But one thing that started to happen that Allison and I were looking at when we began to collaborate on the Streamlining book was that the maps themselves had gotten very cumbersome and very dense, and some of the templates within them were very difficult to read. And then I think the big breakthrough came also in conjunction with the work you Bena and Allison have done on student-centered learning. And that one thing that was clear to us is that curriculum wasn't being written for the student, and that the combination of needing to streamline the curriculum, it was too dense with mapping, and then looking at how maybe we should really look at the way we pose it and lay it out. Maybe it should be more narrative. Maybe that's what is missing here, why students aren't so engaged. And what would happen if we converted our curriculum, taking the best of what we do in mapping and making it accessible to students and to families, and quite frankly, to each other. So it was sort of iterative. And in many ways, storyboarding is a new iteration of curriculum mapping. It's related to it, but it's formatted in a way that's accessible, that's visually appealing, but really importantly, we create the story of the curriculum across a year, written in student-friendly language.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to me because I know that one of the questions that always was a part of our mapping conversations was this whole idea. Is it really something that people are going to use, and how will they use it? And what we found was that when it was dedicated entirely to teachers, they would read the map, but then they would go and do the things that they did with kids. And the two had a certain disconnect. What is interesting to me about what I'm seeing now with the storyboarding is that you start by wanting to tell a story. You start with a narrative. Whereas when you were doing curriculum mapping, you started with a unit, and the unit of study became an entity in itself. And then there would be another unit of study, which became an entity in itself. And so I guess as I was thinking about it from my experience with mapping and with the development of thinking, it became almost episodic. It was kind of like you had a series of episodes rather than a narrative or a story.
I think that's true. And the idea here is, if the student doesn't see the connections across the year, it isn't only that we want to tell the story, it's how can they learn and what makes sense and make meaning if they don't see how what they do every day is connected to what they did a month ago or what's coming. That it makes good learning sense. And I think your description is really a good one, Bena, because what we started to call it were unit silos. Well intended, beautifully designed in curriculum maps, but unit silos that weren't connected. And then we wonder why students can't see the picture and hold on to what they're working on and to think and make those connections, as opposed to making it more explicit, which is what we are attempting to do here with the narratives and the storyboarding.
So it really has become so important. And I think that the whole idea that we're now hearing, so when we said frequently asked questions, one of the frequently asked questions is, if I already have a great map, why would I keep doing this? What is it about this that makes it so different, so unique? And I guess they're a little fearful that we're going to send them back rather than create something that brings them forward.
I think that's really important. Um, one of the things that I think is interesting is when we look at storyboards, and you can look at them on our website, which is curriculumstoryboards.com, and go and look at some samples. What you'll see is that it's a deliberate use of language that's student friendly, but it's also the images that we use, that there's either icons or images that really capture the essence of what's in the story. So we're telling it with visuals, with the titling, with the use of narrative language, with the learning targets, so that the storyline really has a great sweep and is made very deliberately to connect.
So I see in the comments that Eric Ray is here with us from Vista, and I think he's been discovering the powers of the storyboard. Eric, you have any questions you'd like us to play with? If you do, just put them in the chat. We are wide open. This is open game. But meanwhile, I guess what we're saying is that the whole idea that we are able to make this learner friendly and make this really available and accessible to our learners is just such an important point. You know, it's so interesting to me because I see very often that the whole idea of teachers being able to actually do this so rapidly is kind of amazing to me. I kept questioning it when I first started talking with you and Allison was doing all these wonderful workshops in a day or 2 days, and I was, is that really possible? And what I keep seeing is that getting a first draft is definitely possible, that you get a good, fresh view on what it is that you're teaching. But what becomes really the most interesting part of it that I've observed is that as you're getting that new, fresh view of what you're teaching, you're also becoming a more creative writer. And creative writing is something that really kind of jumped out at me. This is so creative, and people are feeling that. They're feeling the inspiration and the excitement of it. I watch them going to look for the great pictures on the internet, trying to say the story and focus it. I don't know. Are you finding the same thing?
I am. In fact, I don't think in my career, honestly, Bena, and we've known each other a long time, I can't think of any initiative I've ever worked on where there is this immediate spark. People get lit up. And I think there's something behind it. One of the things that I think is behind it is the very act of converting what is basically pretty officious language, which is what standards are. They're taxonomies, they're bureaucratic, they're meant to be. And taking curriculum and converting it and owning it and delivering it to students helps people not only reinvest, but it helps message the power of what they're doing. They own it again. Teachers love this. And we're seeing administrators use it for professional development. I've got a couple of superintendents who've just shown me some storyboards they're using with their school boards. That there's something where you get to put your fingers in the clay, reshape it, and give it real power and meaning. It is exciting. That's what I'm finding.
I agree. And I think that today's world, it's so interesting to me that storytelling has become so important in today's world. I notice how often what we see now is commercials that try to tell a story. We see all kinds of things that are kind of using a story to make it concrete. It's like instead of keeping everything so global, it always wants to make it concrete, make it real. And the story makes everything so real. And that's what I think is part of the excitement of thinking to yourself. I remember when we were doing mapping, I used to say to teachers, and I know you always had, picture the empty chair. Remember our empty chair? And it was always like, picture your learner. Remember who it is. Talk to your learner. Speak to your learner, which was just the precedence for why not talk directly to your learner? Why were we trying to use something else? We didn't have to imagine it if we really did that. But what was interesting to me was I would always say to people when they were trying to come up with their maps, don't try to just make a list of all the content, all the skills. Rather, start to think about it and say, if I were hoping that there would be something that you would remember for next year, when your teacher sees you in your next class and they say, so tell me what do you remember most about when you were studying the Civil War? And you could really hear what kids would say. That would really be a sign to you that that's what really matters most. And the skills and all the content support that. But that's what you really want them to remember. So I think what this is doing in the focus of the story is really saying that essentially. Tell the story by making sure you're telling what really matters most to you.
One other thing that I think is important to kind of lay out that has been much more clear for all of us who have been working together on this, and Allison, I know, would agree, is what's been emerging lately that I think is really kind of cool is that you can do storyboards in different versions. And so when we originally wrote the book for ASCD, the Streamlining the Curriculum, and using our storyboarding approach, we didn't talk about versions so much, but that's what's emerged, that I could have a version for my first graders, and I would have the focus of the story and the image and the title, maybe a few learning targets, those I can statements. I might do a version that I send home to families. Maybe they want to know what the standards are. I could have a version where we would have authentic demonstrations of learning. But the one thing that I would caution about this, and it's a lesson we've learned in mapping, is you don't want to put too much on that storyboard. That you don't want to do the same problem we've done before, which is packing too much in, but you can keep it in a way streamlined, which is a very important part of this work. So that the storyboard should be an attractive, simple, and almost kind of like an efficient way of sharing, and an engaging one as well.
Yeah, I think that this is really, it's all so valuable to just keep remembering. And Heidi, let's just talk a little bit about what some people are saying, which is they're asking the question, we did do maps and it wasn't very effective and we never look at them. And
Yeah.
that seems sort of a sad, sorry story to me, because people put a lot of attention and a lot of time doing something that left them without any meaning. So I was trying to think together with you that this was part of the conversations that we've had. What was it that was missing that we could revitalize so that people wouldn't feel as if all that work is for naught?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, Bena. And one of them I just mentioned in the word a moment ago, because I think part of the problem with mapping was the streamlining problem, which was actually what initially Alice and I started writing about. We started writing about storyboarding. When we started our work on this book, it was in 2019 in the fall, and then the pandemic came, and then we had to look at a better way of communicating to families. But the bigger issue was the streamlining question, and I think one of the reasons maps started to lose their utility is because it started to feel in many places, certainly not all, but some of you who are listening, I know you've done great work with your mapping. It started to feel like cut and paste. It felt like let's filler, like let's just put things in there. The standards were just a drop down, and it was a little bit of cherry picking. There wasn't the real alignment to assessment. And sometimes, quite honestly, some of the templates that are used, and in almost all the software platforms, you can create your own template, but there's too much. And so it started to feel like a burden. Let me just get this done. And that was never the initial intention. Nothing like that. In our initial work, in the first books I wrote on mapping, it was never about that. It was to keep it fresh. So I think in some ways, what going to really more deliberate streamlining, making decisions about what to cut, keep, create, keeping them a little leaner and clearer and more purposeful is a good idea no matter whether you did storyboarding or not. But here's the thing. If you have a jam-packed, overwrought curriculum, your storyboard isn't going to be very good. You're going to be trying to jam too much in.
So I feel like there's a sort of reverse thing happening, Bena, and your question points to it. I'm just having an epiphany right now as I hear it, is that in the course of storyboarding, you do have to be thinking of the kids. You can't put in every single thing. You're thinking about what matters most. And then when you go back and you look at your map, you're going, oh, maybe we should consolidate this. What is the priority? Am I being real with my kids? You know, if I have too much in it here, I'm not going to be doing it all. And that this part of it needs to be systemic. That a teacher can lay out a storyboard for any class or any group. The big question in a way is how might this be an impetus to make better decisions and streamlining vertically so we have more room to innovate and make choices as opposed to jam-packed. I think mapping got to be pedestrian in some ways. So it got to be filler, and they weren't used. And why weren't they used? Because they weren't usable. And the best mapping, which does go on, is they're very well done. There isn't too much. People have made some of those decisions.
And don't forget, I think another key piece was where mapping was the most successful, and I believe it will probably be the case with Storyboard as well, was those incredibly rich conversations among teachers, that they actually were able to generate all kinds of exciting ideas, the sharing of what they did in the classroom, the grade level, the PLC, all of that grew out of the mapping that we were doing. And I really believe the PLC probably was an outgrowth of the way we were working with teachers to develop the meaningful collaborations that they could have. And then when they had a map in front of them and they could do that, it just made it all the more meaningful. And now I'm seeing that with the storyboard, that it's not only that it's meaningful conversations among teachers to do that kind of storytelling, but also how meaningful it is when the kids go home and they can talk with their parents and they can talk about it, showing their parents what they've been doing, showing the ideas that they've been engaged with, talking with them and helping them to know more about what they're thinking and doing. It just seems like it's not only gotten us sharper, more streamlined, but it seems like we're also able to think and communicate with far greater clarity.
You know, I was in a call the other day with a very large district, very large. And they initially, they had contacted me to talk to them about work through their mapping work, and they want to make more sense of it. But what has occurred is they had read the book, the Storyboarding and Streamlining book, and are now starting to go, you know what, maybe what will revitalize us is to actually directly revitalize us. In other words, instead of, let's take a look at the very thing you're talking about, to get our conversations going, to look at that, and that we have the best of both. In some ways, it's like in theater, there's the foreground and the background. You want to have the articulated standards thoughtfully aligned. You want to make sure you have really strong vertical alignment. So many things that go on in mapping really can be so valuable. And what you put in the foreground is what you give the students, and they're the ones who have to understand this. This is who it's for. And in the course of doing it, it not only complements, but it feeds one another. I think that this is interesting what we're getting at right now, because there is a mindset that goes to the culture and the communication that is so important and so rich. I love what you said about that. I do. I know exactly what you're getting at. But what happens is if people go through the motions, it's just the opposite. It can be a drag. And that's what you don't want to see.
You know, I was thinking about it and kind of smiling to myself because you know that I did sort of slide in a habit of mind because I said thinking and communicating with clarity and precision. There you go. And one of the reasons why it started to come to mind to me and why I thought it was so important was something that I always used to say whenever I presented some of that material of thinking and communicating with clarity and precision, because fuzzy thinking leads to fuzzy language, leads to fuzzy communication. So when we think that we're saying something because we say that something is awesome or cool or wonderful, and we don't really try to think about what are we really describing and what are we really trying to say, then we're just fuzzy about how we're thinking. What I keep noticing is that whenever someone is asked to write the focus of the story, it really brings them to that habit of mind, because they are a little fuzzy at first about what the story is that they do want to tell. But as they get that storytelling quality to it, it begins to sharpen images. And of course, the images that are on the storyboard only make that better. But it's all about, how am I going to say this in a way that it will be effective communication? So I think it's really such a valuable writerly experience, communicating experience, to just write a storyboard.
I think so too, and I love that you've been working all the habits of mind you want. You're pretty good at that. So
I sneak them in no matter what.
I think one of the questions that we wanted to get at, I think a little bit here, was the direct. We've talked in general about how they can be used with students and parents. If we could dive in a little bit more to some specific, more concrete examples. And these are things that don't happen with curriculum maps. One of the most basic is that students actually have a copy of these, or they're given to parents on back to school night. And I have been hearing a lot of good reports on that, because back to school nights usually happen about this time of year in many parts of the world. And when parents have this document, it can be a version for them with resources for them. Remember, we can do versions of these. Oh my gosh, they're excited. And the phrase I often hear is, it's the refrigerator curriculum, that the students put it on the fridge and the grandparents come over and they talk about what's going on in the class. And the other thing that happens that we don't talk enough about with the student is the response of students. Right now, one of the schools I'm working with, what we're doing is we're giving the students the version that would have the focus of the story, the image, the learning targets, but there'll be an open row, which is the individual student's response. Here's questions that came out of my experience when I did this unit, or I don't think we really did the thing you said we were going to work on, or here was my favorite part of it, or I see that connection. But to actually use them as a very thoughtful reflection piece on a very metacognitive way, and also to anticipate, like, oh, I can't wait till that unit 5. I love that picture and it's looked good to me. That it's a motivator. And I think there's some interesting things we want to start documenting and hearing from people, including anyone listening right now, about ways that these can actively be used with students, and certainly with parents. And we wrote about this in the book, where you can actually put in specific resources or little field trips they could do as a family in conjunction with a unit of study, but also to get parent questions. You know how I just described student questions? Maybe you have a blank one that parents respond to, or a place on a website where they could input some of their ideas. I just think we're beginning to scratch the surface, Bena, on the possibilities. I really do.
I think so too. And I think it's so exciting that we're onto it. I also know that one of the questions that we were going to just make sure that people understand is that there is a relationship between what we used to put in maps, and we can still do that, which is the content, the skills, the things that we as teachers need to remember, the resources we're going to use, the assessments we're going to have. They may not go on the front of the map, which is your advanced organizer, but they serve to support all the work that you're going to be doing. So when new teachers come into the system, very often they're asked the question, how are we going to be planning for our curriculum? And I think that it's really interesting to see that very often creating a story map is a good way for them to get familiar with the curriculum, so that they don't get bogged down with just a particular program that's being used, because it forces them to kind of read it through from the perspective of, what are we really going to be doing here? I think it just gives you a different way of entering the teaching profession. What do you think?
Yeah, I do. You asked me to relay some experiences I've had the last year or two in St. Louis with schools I'm working with there. And one of the principals in this school, and it is a religious school, just for the record, but she had a new teacher who had just been hired, and they have curriculum maps. And they have it in a very good software platform, and they're well done. They're good ones. But she said that this new teacher was really trying to wrap her head around she was elementary, lots of subjects, and there's a lot to do. And she suggested that maybe instead of starting with map, maybe we could get her started with some storyboarding. And it just clicked for her. For the record, I have another school I'm working with where the principal has said, I don't even want to start with the mapping. I want to start with storyboarding, and it'll be much easier. And it's starting to be very interesting out there because now it's more prevalent. People have these options. So as you were saying, there's the foreground, which is the storyboard, and the background, which is the map. You can have both, and they can be mutually dependent. But what's fascinating is to see how it's being used, how the concepts can be used to engage with one another on a systems level, on a school level, as well as with individuals. And new teachers sure like them. I think other teachers like them too when they're looking at another course or a subject they don't teach. Oh, that's the story of Algebra 1. I never understood it before. and it can be connecting. So for new teachers, families, and for other teachers and the faculty too.
So Heidi, I think that I'm not sure that the chat was working. I didn't seem to be able to join the chat for some reason, but I will say that there are some resources that are helpful. So maybe as we follow through, if you come back and look at this or it's recorded, you might want to go to the website that Heidi, you want to talk about your website?
Sure, it's curriculumstoryboards.com. And you're welcome to use the resources there. And we've created a lot of different tools. We have some Padlets, we have some resources, but most of the fundamental information you can get there. And we keep adding to it, and we rotate our gallery of storyboards. But that would probably be a really good place to go. And we'll post that in relationship to this session. Yeah.
And then also, if the one or two of the slides that we were going to show you were taken directly from the technology software that's available. Because if you're wondering, how are we going to make all this come alive and not have tons of paper, there's a digital solution, obviously. And so if you're interested, I think one of the best ones that we're working with right now is eduplanet21.com. So you might want to look at that and see what they're doing to help you make that relationship between the map and the storyboard. So that would be another resource for you to look at. And then finally, Heidi and I wrote a blog that we had a lot of fun writing it because we love going back. We're historians at heart, and historians are storytellers, right? So we went back and we told the story. It was kind of an origin story. The origin of our mapping relationship and how we grew and built with that and how it all led to where we are now with the storyboards. So if you're interested, that blog will be published on the Curriculum Storyboard, I was going to say channel, the Storyboard website, and it will also be published on our Habits of Mind website. So we look forward to another opportunity. We know that we had a little bit of technical difficulty getting started, but once we got going, we're doing fine. So thank you for joining us.
I have one idea before we finish.
Go ahead.
I think you and I should storyboard our history and our journey. How's that?
Hey, all right.
Again, thank you. And we appreciate your participation. And Bena, I always love riding in a saddle next to you. So that was fun.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.